Anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote here in the United States. Please stay tuned to Rainier Avenue Radio.world for shows and special programs highlighting and dedicated to honoring women on Women's History Month here. Please check us out at www.rainierAvenueRadio.world.
Rainier Avenue Radio, your community radio station.
This is Cindy Bray, the host of Heartbeat Radio.
This is Paul Thierson, host of Star
This
Time.
is Paul Schneiderman today on the 73rd edition.
Hey, y'all, welcome to Travelers Guides with Venus and Mars and Princess Robin.
Your home for information about the impact of the
And
coronavirus.
amongst many things that's difficult about this virus is that it's
It's been devastating. There are really heartbreaking stories of people who have.
There isn't anyone that isn't impacted.
shutting our schools down, including all athletic programs.
Your first-hand accounts.
I got new to test and I found out that I was positive.
A lot of people who know me, I'm still the first person they know.
But it was almost like you were patient zero for South Seattle. Your stories of community coming together.
Partner very heavily with Tacoma Urban League, who is doing some amazing work in response.
We're doing things for small businesses. We're giving out loans for small businesses.
And so I think it's very important that we have leaders who feel
I cannot tell you we're calling 20, 30, 40 members.
this crisis in our community. We've been working to address it.
Rainier Avenue Radio, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days.
DJ Dirty John.
Karen Z with Rainier Avenue Radio.
Rainier Avenue Radio.world. Rainier Avenue Radio.world. We got you covered. Local impact, global presence.
Broadcast. Welcome to Rainier Avenue Radio.world and our weekly coverage of the impact of communities. Continuation of our series. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us again here. And then again, now we are aware of the fact that we are and more folks listening to that.
Would you like to see when your favorite Rainier Avenue Radio show comes on? Check out our show schedule, updated weekly at RainierAvenueRadio.world.
Welcome to Rainier Avenue Radio. This is Afternoons with Monique, recording live in Seattle, Washington, every Thursday at 1 p.m. Good afternoon, Rainier Avenue Radio audience. This is Monique Lee, Afternoons with Monique at 1 p.m. Today, I have the pleasure to invite one of the guests that is very relevant to Women's History Month. Today, we're talking about domestic violence. Elizabeth Wilmerding has been working in violence prevention for the past 10 years in both campus and community settings. She's currently the Violence Prevention and Advocacy Program Manager at the University of Washington, Bothell. She strives to bring a lens of social justice and community accountability to her work. Elizabeth is particularly interested in preventing harm in the LGBTQ communities and addressing intersections of violence. And prior to coming to the UW Bothell, Elizabeth was not most recently at UC Berkeley, managing sexual violence prevention programming for undergraduate students. She has a BA from Montana State University and earned her master's degree from UC Berkeley, and has been a campus fellow with Futures of Without Violence. Please, without further ado, let's welcome Elizabeth Wilmerding to the show. Hi, Elizabeth. How are you this afternoon?
Hi, Monique. I'm thrilled to be here with you today.
Well, it's a pleasure having you, especially with the current social climate that we are experiencing today. Thank you for joining us on Rainier Avenue Radio this afternoon. To start, I would like to ask you a little bit about your history. How long have you been teaching and in the domestic violence and violence prevention field?
Yeah, this is work that I've been doing since I was in college. So it's been, I think, a little over a decade that I've been doing this work. And I got involved in it initially doing survivor advocacy. So supporting folks who have been impacted by domestic and sexual violence and helping them to explore their options, have somebody there to support them along the way. And I'm still lucky enough to do some of that work. But I also started moving into some prevention work and education, like you're talking about. So really helping the community and organizations and all kinds of service providers and community members to think about how they can be more aware of these types of harm, how we can move to culture change. And I'm really interested in thinking about prevention at every different level.
That's great. The subject of domestic violence had become such an important topic in the last 40 or 50 years, although it's been undercurrent for a long time in history. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, even just with every year, we really see more awareness and more focus on these issues, which is great. But you're right that it's something that has been happening for as long as humanity has been in existence, unfortunately. These issues around power and control have been present in relationships for, I think, as long as people have been around. But we definitely, with every passing year, we see more and more interest and engagement. And I think, the first domestic violence hotlines and shelters started in the late 60s and early 70s. It was then really in 1994 when the Federal Violence Against Women Act was signed into law for the first time that we really started to see a coming together around these topics.
So, I read quite a bit about domestic violence in the home between domestic partners. I think a large portion of your program dedicate to domestic partnership violence. Is that correct?
Yeah, a large part of the work that I do now.
Right. How long have you been with the UW Bothell?
For about 2 years.
Really?
I'm actually pretty new to the area and also to UW Bothell. And it's been really fun to jump in, get to know the community, figure out what's already been done, because there's been a lot that's been happening before I've gotten here, and then how I can help the community to move forward.
Right. And what got you interested in researching and studying domestic violence and violence prevention, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I started doing the work in college. So I went to Montana State University and I started volunteering as an advocate and a peer educator. And I really just fell in love with it. And at the time I was studying photography, and I realized that while I was interested in photography, that this was actually the direction that I wanted my career to go. So I started looking for more opportunities to volunteer and learn a little bit more about the work. And that led me to move to the Bay Area and get my master's in social work at UC Berkeley so that I could continue my work in the field.
What was your thesis when you studied a Master of Social Work at Berkeley?
Yeah, we didn't actually have a master's thesis. We had a research project, but my focus was on management and planning. So really focused on systems work. So thinking about how can we get our systems to coordinate and work together in a way that's going to best ultimately serve that individual person who's experiencing domestic violence or who has experienced sexual assault. So how can we kind of apply the principles of social work to systems to help them to best serve our community members?
And now you're with the UW Bothell for the last 2 years, and you're the manager for domestic prevention and advocacy program manager. What is your program or your scope of responsibilities there?
Yeah, so my office, the Violence Prevention and Advocacy Program, has two main prongs. One is about prevention, so thinking about culture change, education, a little bit of policy work. How can we basically help every member of the UW Bothell community, so students, staff, and faculty, to know what their resources are, but more than that, even to choose every day to act in a way that's going to prevent harm from happening and to be ready to intervene and support their friends when harm does happen. So that's one aspect. And then the second aspect is about advocacy and support. One of the most important things for somebody who has experienced domestic violence or dating violence or violence in their relationship is that they have somebody who can listen to them from a completely non-judgmental place, help them to feel validated in their experience, and then help them to explore their options and figure out what's available to them to help to reach a goal towards safety, healing, being able to move forward with their lives. So those are the two areas of work that I'm currently doing on the Balfour campus. And, you know, I think that we've seen a lot of support from other folks on campus, and we've seen a lot of engagement, and we're really, we've gained a lot of momentum in the last 2 years, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Very good. When we talk about domestic violence, it's often occurred to me that women bear the brunt of the violence in society. And that has always been, has there been any shift in terms of male-female being the victim of domestic violence, or is your service still primarily focused on supporting women at this point?
You're absolutely right that you know, women have traditionally experienced a lot more violence and a lot more severe violence, and this is also true for trans people. So for trans men and trans women, the data is a little bit sparse, but it seems like those populations actually experience even more severe violence than cisgender women do.
Really?
But we've also seen that data has recently shown that men are probably experiencing more violence than we used to think that they were. So new data shows that it might be between 1 in 7 or 1 in 9 men who have experienced domestic or dating violence, compared to about 1 in 4 women. So still not as many, but a more significant number. We used to think it was like 1 in 17. So a more significant number than we had previously thought. I do think it's important, though, to highlight that while anybody can experience domestic violence, anybody can perpetrate domestic violence, that the severity is still really focused on women. So we know that women, and again, transgender people as well, are often more likely to experience more severe violence. They're more likely to be at risk for homicide. And so while anybody can experience or cause domestic violence, that the most severe violence is still directed mostly at women and at trans people.
And I noticed there's a certain pattern that, you know, the smaller stature people, that, you know, less powerful or maybe even marginalized group of minorities tend to be the recipients of violence. Am I observing correctly?
Yeah, I think that it's all, you know, we need to look at the intersections. So when somebody has any kind of marginalized identity, which in our society, being a woman is a marginalized identity, when there's any marginalized identity that somebody has, then it absolutely increases their risk, and it, you know, it makes them unfortunately more likely to be a target of harm. And that is even more so when somebody has more than one marginalized identity. And so when we talk about women being more likely to experience domestic violence, I think it's also really important to not just talk about women broadly, because I think our default then is white women. So we need to talk about that. Black women are more likely to experience harm. You know, I think something that's on a lot of people's minds recently has been the violence towards Asian women. And Asian women actually about, I believe it's about 55%, they think, that was from, I think, a 2015 study, potentially up to 55% of Asian women in the United States have experienced some type of dating or domestic violence. That's much higher than the general average for women. So we have to be talking about and examining those intersections of identity if we actually want to be able to make progress.
Right. What year was that study where you saw the 55% of Asian women experience domestic violence?
I think that was from 2015.
Oh, pretty recent.
Mm-hmm.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
You know, recently there is a spike in violence against Asian Americans, Asian communities, and I was told that Asian women during the pandemic experienced 2.5%. What is that? 2.5 times more likely to experience violence against them than even their male counterparts, or the more. This is not just for the mainstream population, but this is compared to their male counterparts. Women are more 2.5 times more likely to be the victim of domestic violence. Did you stumble upon that studies, and do you know more specifics on that statistics?
I have not heard that statistic specifically, actually, but it makes a lot of sense, and I absolutely believe that it's true. I think that, what we know about domestic violence is that a lot of the time, first of all, it's rooted in power and control, and a lot of the time, it's because the person who is causing the violence feels like they're losing control or they're losing power in a situation, or oftentimes the victim or the survivor is stepping outside of the gender norms or what's expected of their gender. And I think, again, we have to look at the intersections here. So what is expected of an Asian woman, for example? And if they at all step outside of those bounds, then because of our societal norms, it often leads to violence occurring. And the perpetrators of that violence are often, again, looking for ways to kind of maintain the status quo, maintain their power and control over other people.
That's very interesting. I personally have experienced such description, not only with personal direct connection, but online, interacting with people. There was incidents where a Caucasian man would interact with me and have these specific expectations of how an Asian woman, such as myself, should be behaving and speaking. And when I don't fit the expectations, I get lashed out against, name calling, and put down and assign negative attributes, calling the B word, calling the C word, because I don't fit what they expect Asian women to be. So it's very interesting that you're talking about the intersection of society. Yeah, being a woman, being a minority, and being a go-getter is definitely not going to fit together in a square definition as many Americans or many mainstream people would or might expect.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm so sorry that you've experienced that. And I think you're absolutely right that unfortunately you're not the only one to experience it. It's really common. And especially, when we think about who has the power and control in America, and it's often white men. And they're often then in the position of trying to maintain that by any means necessary. Absolutely.
We are at the mid-section of the show. It is 1:16. You're on Rainier Avenue Radio, and I am Monique Lee with Afternoons with Monique. Today, the station asked me to make a mention about a new program that is being promoted through the station. Let me read this. Are you creative? Do you do creative work in the arts, history, or historic preservation? Are you interested in getting your project financially supported? For Culture wants to support your cultural activities and share them with King County. Currently offering project grants. Apply by April 28th. For more information, please go to forculture.org. So that is what the station manager wants me to remind everybody, that there's a grant being offered, and go to forculture with the number 4.org to apply. All right, back to the show. Today we have Elizabeth Wilmerding from the University of Washington, Bothell, on our show, talking about domestic violence and domestic prevention, violence prevention, and advocacy in society. And we were just talking about Asian women and marginalized communities, transgender community, gays and lesbians being victims of domestic violence. The who, what, how, and aware of domestic violence or violence prevention. So with being that violence is a fact of life, and domestic violence seems to be permeating through the culture for the last 20, 30, 40 years and beyond. And do you see this as a subject that is going to be lessened over time with the number of awareness, conversation, a radio show, TV show we've been addressing this? Have you seen a downward trend of this, of all these violence occurring, Elizabeth?
We certainly have a lot more awareness, and there's a lot more prevention efforts that are happening and a lot more resources that are available. Unfortunately, the research doesn't show that there has been a decrease in the number of incidents that are occurring. So actually the incidents are likely staying the same, but the good thing is that more people are getting connected to support. More people are aware of what to look for. So when they're observing their friends in their relationships or dynamics within their family, they're able to now see something and notice that there's something problematic or that there's a red flag. And people are more aware now of what they need to do after they notice something like that and how they can get somebody connected to support. So all of those things are really showing that we're heading in the right direction. We do now have evidence-based strategies that show us what types of education we can offer to people to help them to know how they can implement healthy relationship strategies within their own relationships, and how they can intervene when they notice harm happening. But I think it's a slow road, honestly. I know that that's not an optimistic answer. I do think we'll get there one day. But we really need all hands on deck and to continue to increase our capacity to change the culture and move the needle.
How in your role do you feel like you can influence what, we all are members of a society, and every one of us have a little bit of influence to our surrounding. I have this radio show. I want to talk about domestic violence and violence prevention. So I invite you on. How can you help our other members of the community from being victims of domestic violence and learn how to protect themselves? Where can they go to find some resources?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have some great state coalitions that are fantastic resources to check out. So we have the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And then we also have a similar coalition, but focused on sexual assault, the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. Both of those are fantastic resources to go to. On their websites, they have databases of all of the local agencies all across the state. So if somebody is looking for support, that's a great place to go to be able to put in your city and find your local resource. But also if you're looking for opportunities for education or training or public events to attend, there's a lot of good information on those coalition websites. So that's one place that I would recommend. There's also a lot of good information put out by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And so if you are interested in kind of some national data and some national and international work, there's some very accessible reports available and trainings available online for free from the CDC. That I think they do a good job of making them like pretty available to folks who aren't doing this kind of day in and day out.
It would be great if after the show you could go on this video recording of our show and put under the comment some of the resources you just mentioned, so people can click on and go there and find more resources to help themselves.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. One of the things I want to bring up about domestic violence and violence in general is that the perpetrators tend to be very clever, and they themselves are able at times project themselves to be the victim and make the victim as the perpetrator. And authority, the police, judges are at times fooled by these perpetrators and punish the victim even more. Custody disputes, you have the court taking the child from the victim and give to the perpetrator. police arresting the victim instead the perpetrator, things of that nature. Do you know about these? Do you know about the statistics of these issues that you can talk about on our show today?
Yeah, good question. I don't have any statistics off the top of my head, but I think you're bringing up a really important point, which is that it can be really complicated, even for service providers who are trained in this area, to figure out how they can basically assess who is the victim and who is the perpetrator, because oftentimes these patterns of power and control have been going on for so long in a relationship. And the perpetrator has gotten really good at making sure that they are able to control the narrative and control the situation.
Right.
So I think it's important, and I think it's been exacerbated often by the pandemic and by the additional isolation. I don't know if you saw or heard about the case, I think out of Michigan earlier this month, where there was a domestic violence court proceeding happening, but it was happening over Zoom. And it turned out that the victim and perpetrator were actually in the same apartment in different rooms, both Zooming in to the court proceeding, which was, of course, a violation of the protection order that was in place. And the prosecutor picked up on the fact that it seemed like the victim was not feeling safe, and they stopped the proceeding. And I think a lot of people were really shocked by that. I also think, unfortunately, those of us who are doing this work were probably not very surprised by it, because we know that these are tactics, like you were saying, that abusers use, and they'll do anything that they can a lot of the time if they feel like they're losing control, to try to get back in the driver's seat and control the narrative.
Right. It's very unfortunate that we are not able to prevent or stopping a lot of these fooling or tricking the authority into believing who's who and who's doing what to who. So I think as a society, we need to be aware that, to listen to, and listen to with our authentic ears, and really discern the dynamic of power between the two parties in order to find out what's what. Because I think we are human, and we are susceptible to listening to someone who may be more persuasive and sounding more powerful than the weaker voice in the room. And the women tend to be the one that, often is the weaker voice in the room, with less financial resources, with less connections to protect themselves. And so they end up being marginalized further, or maybe even victimized further by the people that are around them that's supposed to help them out.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I'm really glad that we have a chance to invite you on the show today and share some of your thoughts and resources and the work that you do at the UW Bothell as Violence Prevention and Advocacy Program Manager. Next week, we're going to have Professor Connie So, also from the University of Washington. She is a professor of ethnic studies, and she's been at the University of Washington for, I think, 35 plus years, coming on our show to talk about the different issues of also societal, marginalized society in different ethnicities. So everyone tune in on April 1st at 1 p.m. to watch the next episode. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining our show today and sharing with us about what you know and the resources that people can access to protect themselves, especially during this pandemic when everyone's stuck at home and domestic violence is on the rise and Asian hate crime is on the rise. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone. You're on Afternoons with Monique. I'm Monique Lee, your host, and this is Rainier Avenue Radio. Signing off now.